So I'm going to move on now just to talking about disability living allowance. I'm assuming that the vast majority of people who are taking part in today's session are familiar with DLA. I'm assuming that probably most families will already be getting DLA, perhaps not at the higher rate for mobility, but getting other levels of DLA. But just in case there are any parents here today who are not really familiar with the benefit, who are not getting it just now, I'm going to do a very quick essentials of what you need to know about DLA. So it's the main benefit for disabled children aged under 16. It applies in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. In Scotland, it's been replaced by a benefit called child disability payment. If you are a parent in Scotland, this session will probably still be useful to you though, because the rules for the new benefit in Scotland more or less replicate the DLA rules. So it has the same sort of tests around severe mental impairment, around being virtually unable to walk for higher rate mobility under that benefit. The benefit's not means tested, which means it doesn't matter whether you're working or not, what savings you have, what income you have. There are certain tests you need to make that are linked to your child's immigration status and their length of stay in the UK. But other than that, it's generally just based on your child's condition, and in particular, how that condition impacts on their day-to-day life. So, you know, the entitlement is really just based on your child's condition. So there's two types of payment, which are known as components. There's a care component, which is about the help that your child needs indoors, and a mobility component, which is about how your child manages outdoors. And it's that mobility component that we're going to be focusing on today. So in terms of the mobility component, this is really about the help that your child needs in getting around. For some children, that's going to be because of physical problems like pain or breathlessness. But for other children, they're going to qualify for the mobility component because of things like learning disabilities, challenging behavior, anxiety disorders, things of that nature. So there's two rates of the mobility component. There's a lower rate, which can be awarded from the age of 5. And that's awarded where a child doesn't qualify for the higher rate, is generally able to walk, but needs much more guidance or supervision in getting around outdoors than other children of the same age. So this rate of mobility will be very commonly awarded, perhaps where a child's maybe got certain sensory impairments. It'll be awarded where a child perhaps has an anxiety disorder, which means they maybe have panic attacks outdoors and need someone to be there to help them with that. And it's very commonly awarded where children have learning disabilities, where a child has maybe a very reduced sense of danger outdoors, where a child might be vulnerable for other reasons. So if a child doesn't qualify for the higher rate of the mobility component, but they have learning disabilities, autism, challenging behaviors, they're almost certainly going to be a very strong candidate for low rate mobility at the very least, as long as they're aged at least 5. And then we also have the higher rate mobility, which can be awarded from the age of 3. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at that rate. And one of the things I should probably say at this time is the lower age limit of 3 is an absolute. It doesn't matter how severely disabled your child is, how significant the mobility problems they have outdoors are. There is absolutely no way of getting mobility component for a child who's aged under 3. You can ask for the higher rate mobility to be looked at from 3 months before their birthday, but the earliest date it can be paid is from the date that they turn 3. There were attempts to try and contest that. There was a case that went all the way to the Court of Session, arguing that the 3-year rule was unlawful, that it made more sense for, if there was to be an age limit, that it should be somewhere around 2 rather than 3. But unfortunately, that case was unsuccessful. So in looking at the higher rate mobility component, one of the things we kind of have to make clear is that there's very different routes to qualifying. So different children will qualify for the higher rate mobility for very different reasons. And there are some rules that basically allow some children to qualify automatically just on the basis of their condition. So for example, if a child is both blind and deaf, they will qualify automatically, as will some children who have a severe visual impairment. And that's measured using something called the Snelling scale, which measures visual acuity. And if a child meets certain tests under that, they will automatically get higher rate mobility. Children who are born without feet or double amputees also qualify automatically. There's then a group of children who qualify based on proving that they meet certain tests. One small group of children who qualify are those where the exertion required to walk would lead to a serious deterioration in their health. This is generally quite a small group of children qualify, with those with very severe health conditions like a lung condition or a heart condition. What you need to show is that the exertion required would lead to such a serious deterioration that the recovery from that would either require medical intervention or would take a very significant period of time. And by that, we mean sort of weeks or months rather than hours or days. But what we're really interested in today is the last two routes. These are a route that allows you to qualify if you can show that you're either unable to walk or, in our case, virtually unable to walk as a result of your child's physical condition as a whole. And we're going to spend a bit of time later looking at what that means in practice. But we're also going to be looking at the rules of severe mental impairment. And these are a very specific set of rules that basically allow some children who have a severe mental impairment and challenging behaviors to qualify for the higher rate mobility. And that's what we're going to start by looking at today. So the first thing to say is that this isn't a single test. To qualify on the grounds of severe mental impairment is actually you have to meet a number of different tests. And we kind of break it down into 5 sort of tests that your child must meet. Now, one of the things you have to be clear about is in order to qualify, your child must meet each and every one of these tests. It's not enough for your child to meet 90% of the tests or even 95% of the tests. If there's a single one of these tests that they don't meet, they're simply not going to qualify on the basis of the severe mental impairment rules. And a lot of parents phone us on our helpline and they'll say that they've been refused on the grounds of severe mental impairment and they want to challenge that, and they ask how they should go about it. And one of the first things we have to say to them is like, do you know which of the tests has not been accepted? Because if you've been refused and you're trying to challenge on these grounds, you really want to try and get as clear an idea from the DLA unit as possible as to which of these tests they've accepted and which are actually in dispute. That can be quite difficult at the sort of decision stage because the information in the decision letters often is quite vague. But certainly if you're at the stage of having a mandatory reconsideration or an appeal, you would hope that the information that you've got in the decision at mandatory reconsideration stage or the submission that's been done as part of the appeal will set out which of these in particular the DWP didn't feel were being met. Now, I want to say from the very start, before we get into these rules in detail, that there's a few things I need to make clear. The first thing is that the rules are very complicated, very complex, and also that they're not easy to meet. I have to be honest, it's not easy to qualify for higher rate mobility on these grounds. In fact, it's very difficult to qualify. And the rules have been very tightly drawn and they're very detailed and specific. And that makes it quite difficult for children to clearly meet the test 100%. The other thing is that the rules don't always necessarily make sense, or they don't necessarily seem very logical in a lot of ways. So for example, one of the tests is that your child must be on the highest rate of the DLA care component. But the obvious question is, why should that be the case? What difference should it make whether your child's on high rate care? How does that impact on their mobility needs and their ability to get around out of doors? So it doesn't necessarily make sense. And there's undoubtedly an argument that the severe mental impairment rules should probably be amended and made much more sort of logical and streamlined. But the reality is, until that happens and until the law is changed, this is the rules that we have to deal with. These rules are written into the legislation, into the acts, and into the regulations. So even if the DLA unit felt sympathetic towards you, they can't actually award DLA on these grounds unless they're sure that your child meets all of the tests. So we're going to run through the tests in a bit of detail now, looking at each one in turn, looking to see what it means in practice, and looking to see where the problem areas can sometimes emerge. So we're going to start with the very first one, which is you need to be able to show that your child is on the highest rate of personal care. So what this means in practice is your child not only qualifies or not only requires frequent attention or continual supervision throughout the day, but that they also require some care during the night as well. So the difference between the middle rate and the highest rate of the care component is not to do with necessarily the amount of care that your child needs. It's more to do with when that care is happening. So in order to get the highest rate, you need to show that your child needs both care by day and also care by night. If your child needs huge amounts of care by day, if they need care the whole time they're awake, but they sleep well, and you don't have to get up during the night to see to them, then unfortunately, you're simply not going to be a candidate for highest rate care, and that means they will not qualify for higher rate mobility on the grounds of severe mental impairment. Now, sometimes parents will describe the higher rate care as being the 24-hour rate, but that's really misleading because there's no need to be up all night. The test for nighttime care under DLA is not even that you're up for the majority of the night. What the test is that your child requires care during the night that's either prolonged or repeated. Now, prolonged means that it's at least 20 minutes, but it might only be once during the night. Repeated means it's at least twice, but it might be for shorter periods. Now, it's worth noting that the test is not that it has to be prolonged and repeated, but prolonged or repeated. And what that means is, in principle, it could be possible for a child who only needs care once during the night for 20 minutes or half an hour to qualify for the nighttime test. What I would kind of say about that is there's another sort of general test that applies to the care. So you'd also have to show that the amount of care that's being provided is substantially greater than that's required by other children of the same age who are not disabled. Now, one of the things that you need to look at where your child's, say, on middle rate care is why they're currently on middle rate care. Is it because of the daytime needs or is it because of the nighttime needs? Because that will tell you which other side you need to argue for in order to get higher rate. So if your child's been awarded the middle rate for daytime needs, then obviously to try and get the highest rate, it's all going to be about arguing around the need for nighttime care. If your child's got the middle rate because they need nighttime care, then obviously you're going to have to argue around the need for daytime support. If you're not sure what rate your child's been awarded, you'll have to, not sure why your child's been awarded the middle rate care, whether it's been for day or night care, you'll need to contact the DWP to find out. What's clear is it can't be both. Because if your child has been accepted as needing both care by day and night, they should be on the highest rate already. One of the issues that sometimes arises around the high rate care and nighttime needs is what do the DWP mean by nighttime? And although it can change slightly from family to family, what you need to understand is that nighttime doesn't arise or start when the child goes to sleep. It starts when the household, when the adults would normally go to bed. And that can vary slightly from family to family, but generally speaking, the DWP, the DLA unit would usually treat nighttime as starting around about 11 o'clock at night and finishing around 6:30 or 7 in the morning. So if you've got a child who needs care, say at 9 o'clock at night when you're trying to settle them down to sleep, unfortunately, that's not going to be treated as part of their nighttime needs. That's going to be seen as part of the daytime instead. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to the next of the tests that's used in severe mental impairment. So just to reiterate, the tests are: child must be on the care component at the highest rate. Child must have an incomplete physical development of the brain or a state of arrested development and have a severe impairment of intelligence and social functioning. Child must exhibit disruptive behavior, which is extreme. As a result of that, they must require another person to regularly intervene and physically restrain them. And the child's behavior must be so unpredictable that the whole time they're awake, they need another person present and watching over them. So the second of those tests, it's quite a complex clause because it's got two parts to it. The first part is kind of like a diagnostic test, I suppose. So you need to show that the severe mental impairment that your child has, the impairment of intelligence and social functioning, it results from a specific type of condition. So you need to be able to show that your child's condition is caused by either an incomplete physical development of the brain or a state of arrested development. So incomplete physical development of the brain means that the child's brain hasn't really grown or developed properly. And normally that's something that can be either seen or assessed, usually via some sort of imaging technology. Arrested development, interestingly, a lot of people, when they describe this test, they say incomplete physical development of the brain or arrested development of the brain. But actually, that's not what the rules say. The arrested development isn't limited to arrested development of the brain. It can mean any sort of arrested development, any emotional or functional delay or lack of development, whether or not it's linked to the brain, as long as there's a physical cause for that arrested development. So that means that, for example, children who have maybe a genetic condition or a chromosome disorder can argue that their child, or in fact, should be able to argue that their child meets this test. So there are clearly some conditions where it's been accepted that if your child has a diagnosis of a particular type, they're going to fall into this, at least meet this part of the test. So that includes children with autism, it includes children with Down syndrome, and as I've said, certainly children with genetic or chromosome disorders as well. However, there are other conditions where you're really going to struggle to argue that your child meets this test. And what happens if you don't have a diagnosis? Certainly that's going to be very tricky. When we're advising families, we always try and challenge them, this kind of myth that you cannot claim DLA without a diagnosis. The reality is you don't need a diagnosis to claim DLA. All you need to be able to show is that your child has a condition of some sort. You don't need to be able to specify which condition it is. And that's true generally for a claim for DLA, but it's not so true for these particular rules, because there's a difference with the severe mental impairment test. Because of this need to show that your child has a condition of this type, if you don't have a diagnosis, in reality, it's going to be really difficult to convince any decision maker that your child meets this test. I'm not going to say it's impossible. I suppose it might be potentially possible to convince a decision maker that on the balance of probabilities, your child has a condition of this type, but yeah, I think it would be hugely difficult, very, very challenging to do that. So just in terms of case law a little bit, I'm going to talk about case law throughout today's session. Just to explain what case law is, first of all. So what happens is where there's disagreements about what the law means or how it should be interpreted, what happens is cases will go to review or mandatory reconsideration and then to appeal at the tribunal. But they can then go further to something called the upper tribunal, and that's where a judge will make a decision about how the law should be interpreted. And these decisions, these judges' decisions, they form case law, and they provide guidance to decision makers about how the law should be interpreted. And they are kind of binding on tribunals and decision makers. So they can't just be ignored by a decision maker. If a judge has said that this is how the law should be interpreted, decision makers have to follow the reasoning of the judge. Now, interestingly, although it's binding on decision makers and tribunals, case law is not binding on other judges. So you sometimes do get cases where two different judges might look at a similar issue but come to different conclusions. So sometimes we do have conflicting case law, and we're going to be looking at that a little bit later on, because there are some areas in the SMI tests where there is conflicting case law and no disagreement about how the rules should be consistently applied. But in terms of this particular case law, I'm flagging these ones up because they're quite helpful. The first two cases here are quite helpful, particularly if you've got a child who's got an autistic spectrum disorder, because these decisions, CDLA 1678 of 97, it was a very detailed case. It was looking at the medical sort of understanding of autism. It involved quite eminent specialists in the condition, and that decision established as a fact of law that autism is indeed a disorder of the development of the brain, and thus fell into the definition of a condition that was caused by a state of arrested development or incomplete physical development of the brain. So we shouldn't really see cases where families are with a child who's on the autistic spectrum is being refused because they don't meet this specific diagnostic test. That shouldn't be happening. The reality is we sometimes still see decisions like that, but they should be fairly easy to challenge because we not only have that decision, there was a further decision made in 2007, CDLA 2288 of 2007, which actually involved a case where a child had been refused on the basis that they didn't have an arrested development or incomplete physical development of the brain. And the judge in that case said, look, you cannot argue this. The DWP is bound by a law that's already been established that sets out that autism does meet that test, and all other decision makers must follow the guidance that's been given. So yeah, those two pieces of case law are really useful if the DWP do try and argue that a child with autism doesn't meet this diagnostic test. Unfortunately, the case law is not helpful in some other cases. It's not helpful in terms of children who have ADHD in a decision that was made in 1997, 5153 of 97. The judge in that case, again, based on quite detailed medical evidence, said it wasn't possible to attribute ADHD to a state of incomplete physical development of the brain or a state of arrested development, and that the assertion that it was a form of brain dysfunction was unproven. The only positive thing I can really say about that is that the judge at least left it open that that might change over time, that due to developments in genetics or medical imaging, it could be possible that in the future, evidence might come to to bear that might show that ADHD could be looked at differently. But at the moment, it's hugely difficult to try and argue that a child with ADHD meets this test. So let's say that you get through that sort of diagnostic test, and it's established that your child does, or accepted that your child does meet the diagnostic test. You've then got to go a little bit further and show that as a result of that condition, your child has a severe impairment of intelligence and also a severe impairment of social functioning. So in terms of severe impairment of intelligence, we see quite a lot of decisions where the DWP will, pick statements from educational reports, take them out of context and try and argue that, they're an indicator that the child's intelligence is not impaired. I mean, in those kind of cases where they're taking things out of context, what you should be looking to do as a parent and challenging that is trying to just gather together, all the evidence that you can about your child's educational attainment, any evidence that, in comparison to the contemporaries, they're not operating at the same sort of level academically. If they've got difficulties in terms of their understanding and their language skills and things like that, all of that kind of stuff you need to try and put together to counter, the sort of the DLA's sort of tendency to try and cherry pick statements and taking them out of context. But what's really interesting is that over a period of time, we kind of now have a more sort of nuanced understanding of what the test really should be. And there is some really useful case law that basically says it's not simply a test of IQ of your child's sort of intellect. And that although that's a useful starting point, and certainly if you've got a child's got an IQ of less than 55, they definitely should be seen as having a severe impairment of intelligence. What the case law suggests is that it shouldn't be relied on exclusively, and that intelligence is not really just a test of how you function in an abstract sort of IQ test, but also should look at things like insight and how you can use your intelligence usefully. So it's actually a test of how you can apply your intelligence in the real world. Do you have the ability to weigh up things, to see the world as it really is? And in particular, there's been some case law that suggested that what's a quite critical issue is whether the child has any sense of danger or not. And that in itself, a lack of any sense of danger could in itself suggest that the child has a severe impairment of intelligence. So there's CDLA 3215 of 2001, which basically said in that particular case, a child who has no sense of danger lacks such a fundamental aspect of basic human intelligence that it must be the case that his intelligence is severely impaired. The only thing I would say about that decision is, that judge in making that finding did, say that you would have to be clear that it was a child who had no sense of danger rather than a child who was aware of the dangers but was deliberately choosing to take the risks. And then CDLA 2414 of 2012 says that in assessing useful intelligence, consideration needs to be given to any evidence that the claimant lacks a sense of danger. So, sure, try and get as much information as you can about any delayed development around your child's intellect, difficulties in terms of learning, communication, language. All of those things are really important. But even if your child potentially scores quite highly in abstract intelligence tests, there's still a case to argue that your child requires or has a severe impairment of intelligence if they have no sense of common dangers. So the other test that you have to show is that your child also has a severe impairment of social functioning. We have to be honest, we come across a lot less cases where this is in dispute, particularly where a child's on the autistic spectrum. It's usually accepted. But just to cover all the bases, this is really a test of looking at how your child functions in social situations. Things like your child's interest in and ability to play and mix with other children will be a critical issue here. If there's little interest in others, that would suggest, an impairment of social functioning. There's some interesting case law saying that, if a child's got poor language skills and communication skills, then that's going to be probably evidence of an impaired social functioning and should be taken into account. That piece of legislation also suggested that it's not just looking at how the child functions in terms of social functioning with people they know well, with friends and family, but also, their ability to interact with people they're not familiar with. And that's the case even if the claimant's a child. Okay. So we're going to have a short break from the session just now, just so Marion and I can review some of the questions that have come in. If you just bear with us a couple of minutes, we'll try and talk through some of the questions that have come in and provide the answers if we can. So just bear with me a few minutes. I'm going to just have a review. Marion, is there any particular questions that came in you thought might be quite interesting?
Yeah, there's some interesting questions coming in thick and fast now, Derek. I'll just go through some of them. I've kind of grouped some together as well to make it easier to answer everybody. A couple of questions about the appeals process, and I think maybe if there's time at the end, you might be covering that briefly, just what people should do. Somebody was asking whether they should quote case law in the actual application form. I would suggest that it's a good idea to be aware of the case law when you're completing the form, but you might not necessarily have to quote case law in the actual application. I don't know if you might think differently. I think that case law is useful for when you're having to challenge a decision that you don't agree with. There's other questions about child who behaves themselves at school but not at home, and I think that's a matter of degree. It's difficult when that happens under this SMI test particularly. That can lead to a nil decision for the higher rate mobility quite often, but I still think it's worth pursuing when a child's in a structured environment. It could be argued that they're okay and they don't need any restraints, so they don't really qualify for the higher rate mobility under the SMI test. However, there is some argument as well to suggest that that's not always the case, that just because a child behaves well in a structured environment, for most of the time they'll perhaps be at home or in other situations, not in school. And so if they need a lot of that sort of help, restraint, watching over, if they fulfill the tests under these other conditions and situations, then perhaps that can be looked at. So it's always worth getting advice if you've been turned down just because your child behaves in school. What else? People were asking about physical conditions in association with autism, for example. If your child has a combination of conditions, what it means is that you would have more different reasons for getting the higher rate mobility. So you could qualify perhaps under the severe mental impairment test and the behavioural issues, or you might equally qualify under another specific test to do with being virtually unable to walk, which we haven't covered yet in the session, but we'll be covering. We're not covering the physical aspects so much of mobility. So if people need advice about that, they would need to either call our helpline or have a look at our website to see that we have got a guide to that. This is specifically about these very specific tests to do with behaviour under certain conditions.
Yeah,
Somebody was asking about, sorry, Derek. Yeah.
No, on you go, Marion. Sorry.
Somebody else was asking about night. There's been a couple of questions about the nighttime needs for the care component, which is important to the high rate mobility for some people. And it's one of these, Derek mentioned at the start, that these rules, they've been going about for a long time, and the interpretation has changed over time, and they don't necessarily make sense. That's all we can say about them, really. So the fact that somebody is unable to get from A to B because of severe behavioural issues, it shouldn't have anything to do with whether or not they have nighttime needs, but unfortunately it does at the moment. So you do have to show, if it's under the, if you're trying to argue under the specific SMI test for the high rate mobility, you do need to have the high rate care first in place. And that leads on to some of the other questions around people being a bit anxious about asking for what's called a supersession, asking DLA to look again at their claim, because of course we all know that that can lead to not just a refusal, but it can lead to the benefit being reduced, perhaps. Our experience is that that doesn't happen very often. It's very unlikely to happen if you have a specific diagnosis, especially, but it can happen. So you have to be careful to safeguard the benefit awards that you have. So make sure that good information goes into the DLA unit when you're asking them to look again in order to try to get the high rate care. And the things that count for the high rate care, somebody was asking whether melatonin would, having to administer melatonin through the night would count. Well, yes, that should count as a need for help with medication, counts as a care need, but so do lots of other things. And it's more to do as well with how often you have to do it or how long does it take you. So the high rate care is also quite specific. You've got to either be taking about half an hour to do one thing through the night, or you've got to show that you have to get up repeatedly, so just more than one time. So if you have to get up twice in a night to help your child in some way, then that should count. And it has to be most nights of the week, but not every single night. And as Derek was pointing out, the night time starts when most people would be expected, adults would be going to bed up until when they would normally want to get up. And that can vary, although commissioners and higher up judges have said, I think it's about, between the hours of 11 and 7 a.m. in the morning, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean that everyone's got to fit into that. It could be that somebody suggested that they would normally want to go to bed at 9 o'clock. It certainly is arguable. It's worth pointing that out, that if you're still having to stay up till 10 and 11 when you would want to have gone to bed because your child needs help, then you could argue that that would be your normal bedtime, that your nighttime starts a bit earlier perhaps than other people's. It's difficult because everyone's different, so you have to just try, I think. So that's the nighttime needs are difficult sometimes, and you don't have, for nighttime needs, you don't have to show that there's a medical need for you to be up to look after your child through the night. It might be that the child wakes up with disturbed sleep, they might be having nightmares, they might be upset, and you're going in to comfort them and help them back to sleep. That also counts as care needs. So that's something to get advice on if you're not sure about that side of things. I'm seeing that. I'm just having a check to see if there's anything else. And just remember that some people are saying, well, because I only get the middle rate care, does that mean I can't get the high rate mobility? You need to get the high rate care to qualify for the high rate mobility under this specific test of severe mental impairment, which Derek's just outlined. But there is another test as well, and it's possible that you could qualify under a different test for the high rate mobility. So don't be put off if you think you'll never get the high rate care for your child because they sleep all night. wait and see till at the end of the session you might have changed.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's enough now, probably.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Maureen. That's great. Okay, I'm going to move on to looking at the other sort of 3 tests that make up the severe mental impairment route. And these are all sort of linked to behavior. They're all to do with challenging behavior in different ways. So there are 3 tests, all around your child's need for restraint, supervision. And the first of the tests you have to meet is that you need to be able to show that your child exhibits extreme and disruptive behavior. Now, we get lots and lots of calls from parents who've been refused high-rate DLA on the basis of severe mental impairment, and the decisions will say something like, there's no evidence that the child is violent or aggressive. And that's a really common thing to see in decision letters. But one of the things we need to point out is that that's not the correct test. So there's not a requirement that your child have violent or aggressive behavior. The test is that they have disruptive behavior that's extreme. And what case law has said is that these phrases, disruptive behavior and extreme behavior, should be given their sort of everyday meaning. And so disruptive literally means behavior that disrupts, that disturbs or causes problems or interrupts what would otherwise normally happen. So violence and aggression doesn't necessarily have to be involved. What we do have to acknowledge, though, is that there must be a need for regular restraint to avoid a risk of injury or damage to property as a result of that disruptive behavior. Extreme means out of the ordinary. And again, case law said that extreme behavior is a type that regularly requires a substantial degree of intervention and physical restraint. But it's not just things like a child who's biting, kicking, punching, or spitting. Certainly, those kind of behaviors, if your child exhibits them, is definitely going to meet this test. But there are many other behaviors that would also fall into this category. So for example, a child who runs out into the middle of the road, a child who perhaps will lie on the pavement or on the ground, bang their head, a child who perhaps might try and climb up on parked vehicles or climb into gardens as you're walking down the street. All of those kind of behaviors potentially would cause disruption and would be seen as extreme, and also would necessitate a need for restraint or to avoid a risk of either injury or damage to property. So those kind of behaviors can count as well. Interestingly, there's a decision, CDLA 1044 of 2013, where a child had epilepsy as well as severe learning disabilities. And in that case, the judge said that the seizures that the child had linked to their epilepsy could also be taken into account as disruptive behavior that was extreme and requiring restraint. So there was no aggression, no violence there, but those behaviors caused by the epilepsy should be taken into account alongside any other disruptive or extreme behavior that the child had. The other thing that's worth noting here is that although this test is used in a mobility sort of sense, so it's looking at whether your child is entitled to the mobility component at the higher rate, the behaviors themselves are not limited to disruptive and extreme behavior out of doors. So also any disruptive or extreme behavior that your child has indoors should also be considered. So for example, if your child would be at risk of putting things into their mouth that they could swallow, if they're a child who might perhaps, be at risk in the kitchen of like playing with sharp knives, if they're a child who might try and climb out of windows or jump down the stairs, or a child who might kick a hole in bedroom doors or damage furniture if they become very frustrated. All of those kind of behaviors should be taken into account in deciding whether that child has disruptive behavior that's extreme. The next sort of behavior test that's linked to that is you need to show that as a result of that disruptive behavior, your child requires regular physical restraint to avoid a risk of injury or damage to property. Now, there's two main questions I think that come up around this. One is what's meant by restraint, and the other is, well, what do they mean by it being regular? So in terms of what physical restraint looks like, I mean, we're certainly not talking about someone having to, like, wrestle a child to the ground. In fact, the case law suggests that in many cases, physical restraint need not involve any force at all. So, a firm hand on the arm of a child to stop further complications might be enough. In a decision 943 of 2011, what the judge said in that case was, well, it really, what restraint looks like is actually going to vary depending on the circumstances and depending on the child. So for example, while a hand on the arm of a small child who's very slight, a 5 or a 6-year-old might be sufficient, what restraint looks like for a 6-foot 15-year-old is going to be something very different. So, for a much larger, more physically imposing child, it might involve, say, 2 adults interlinking their arms with the child, something like that, to try and, prevent them from injuring themselves. The other question that comes up is about what's meant by regular. And again, we'll see a lot of decisions where parents will phone us and they read out part of the DLA decision letter, and it will say something like, the child doesn't meet the test of severe mental impairment because they don't need physical restraint all of the time, or they don't need continuous restraint all of the time. And the problem is that that is not what the test is. There's no requirement that the child requires restraint all of the time, constantly or continuously. And this was set out quite well in a specific decision that says, arguing that extreme behavior and restraint is required constantly, continuously, or all the time sets the eligibility criteria too high. Essentially, your child should meet the test as long as it could be said that they require it regularly and in the ordinary course of events. How different decision makers interpret that is obviously difficult to predict. But if you can convince a tribunal or a decision maker that overall, in the sort of regular course of your normal child's life, they require physical restraint, particularly when outdoors, then that's something that definitely should be put them in the sort of grounds where they potentially meet this test. You also need to show in the third of these behavioral tests that your child is so unpredictable that the whole time they're awake, they require another person to be present and watching over them. And in some ways, this is one of the most contentious and difficult of the tests to meet, because there's a lot of disagreement in case law about exactly how this should be interpreted. And we spoke earlier about different judges coming to different sort of conclusions about how this should be interpreted. And this is one of the areas where there's a large degree of disagreement. What is not in dispute is that this test is not just looking at your child's needs when out of doors, okay, because it says whenever they are awake. So it's not enough to show that your child needs someone to be present and watching out of them out of doors. You also need to show that they need to be someone to be present and watching over at home, at school, or wherever else they are. Now, the other issues, though, are much more contentious, and that's around what does it mean to say that someone is present and watching over. Now, some judges have taken the view that quite literally, that means that the carer must be in the room with the child, with basically eyes on the child the whole time, other than very short comfort breaks. For example, decision RDLA 9 of 02 says that the carer must be both present and watching over. And it doesn't seem to me that these conditions can be fulfilled where the carer is on one side of a door and the child is on the other. Okay, so there is, in that judge's view, it literally means that you're in the same room as the child, watching over them. But what's happened is there's been a number of other decisions that have taken a sort of more nuanced view, I think, and said they don't agree with that judgment. In CDLA 965 of 2012, the judge in that case said that they felt as long as the carer was close enough to hear what the claimant was doing, so if they're somewhere that's in close proximity to the disabled child, and if they're looking in on the child with sufficient regularity, even if the child's bedroom door is shut, it doesn't inevitably mean that the carer isn't present and watching over. So what, in that case, what the judge was saying is that, you might not be in the room with the child all the time, but if you're in very close proximity to them, if you're listening in all the time, if you're in a sort of heightened state of awareness or anticipation, then that might be sufficient to allow you to meet the test. In that decision, the judge also made the point that the test here is whether the child requires another person to be present and watching over. And what that means is, do they reasonably require that? So what that means is it's not the care or watching over that the child actually gets that's looked at, but what you can be said to need. So, some children in an ideal world may receive a higher level of care than they're actually receiving, or a higher level of watching over than they're actually receiving, because the practicalities for the parent who might have other children in the house that they need to look after means that they perhaps would, while they would like to be there with their child watching over them in the room, they may have other demands on their time that means that's not possible. So as long as they can argue that the child reasonably requires that level of care, then that might be sufficient to meet the test. It's also been pointed out in another case that the test is actually watching over, not watching, and that possibly watching over is more something of exercising protective care, of being around to supervise the child, rather than actually physically being in the same room and keeping the child in your sight. So, there's disagreement here between judges about exactly how tightly this test should be applied. Now, Marion had mentioned earlier on also the issue about intervention not being needed so much in certain structured environments, and whether or not you can qualify if your child's needs for restraint and need for watching over are not as pronounced perhaps in a school as they would be perhaps at home or elsewhere. And again, this is an area, as Marion had touched upon, where there's actually quite a lot of disagreement between judges. In some cases, judges have taken the view that if the structured regime of a school, for example, is sufficient to prevent the disruptive behavior from happening, then the test will not be met, that the child doesn't qualify. But actually other judges have taken a different view entirely. So in CDLA 2955 of 2006, the judge said in that case that if the claimant, sometimes in a well-controlled environment where intervention isn't necessary, but other times, as in other environments where intervention is really regularly required, then that child could still possibly satisfy the test. So, it's still possible to argue that your child meets the SMI test, even if their behaviors are much less pronounced in a highly structured environment like a school. But there is a risk that a decision maker or a tribunal might not award because they might prefer the more sort of strict interpretation. And this is an area where there's a lot of disagreement and there's been a lot of dispute in tribunal decisions about how it should be followed. I want to say just a little bit about arguing for high rate mobility on the grounds of severe mental impairment, where it's a very young child. A lot of parents will ask us, is it possible to get high rate mobility on the grounds of severe mental impairment for a child who's 3 or 4? And the reality is it is certainly feasible. As I said earlier, it's not possible to get any rate of mobility for a child who's under 3. But if your child's 3, 4, 5, then as long as you can show that they meet the severe mental impairment test, there should be no reason that you can't qualify on these grounds. And we have to be realistic, though, and say it'll probably be slightly more difficult or slightly more challenging to qualify on these grounds. And that's because, first of all, the younger a child is, the harder it might be to establish that they've got a severe impairment of intelligence, the ability to measure the child's sort of intellect and their abilities might be more difficult the younger they are. But also the other thing is you need to be able to convince a decision maker or a tribunal that any extreme and disruptive behaviors and any need for restraint is definitely stemming from the child's disability rather than from their age. So, it does make it a bit more complicated and a bit more challenging, but there's certainly no reason why it shouldn't be possible. Okay, so we're going to have another short break. We've kind of covered the severe mental impairment rules now, all 5 of the areas. So Marion and I will again have a quick review of the questions that have come in and try and answer some of them just now. Okay, just bear with me a few minutes. Marion, was there anything in particular you saw came in?
Well, there are a lot of questions. Quite a lot of them are actually very specific to the individual child, which obviously this is what this session's about. It's not easy to answer those questions, I don't think, but we can try to do that afterwards. I think that some people are asking about specific conditions and whether that would qualify. And I think it's just to emphasize that for this particular test, yes, you do need to have some sort of diagnosis, whereas you don't for any other parts of DLA. But just having the diagnosis itself isn't necessarily going to mean that you will qualify for the higher rate mobility either. It is all to do with meeting all of the tests that Derek's been outlining. You've got to satisfy all of the conditions relating to the test. So, for example, if a child has FASD, as it's called, I think that's fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, then that could mean that that child satisfies parts of these tests if they have behaviour which requires a lot of supervision, support, watching over, if the behaviour is challenging, and if it can be shown that the condition stems from a physical cause to do with the brain, the development of the brain, then I think that is very possibly the case with fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. So I think that is possible for the people that were asking about that test. I wouldn't rule it out, certainly. We use the examples of autism quite a lot because a lot of parents do call whose child has autism, but there's a lot of conditions that might well fit into the severe mental impairment category in terms of the developmental aspects of the brain. It's always worth a try anyway. But you do have to satisfy all the conditions and be getting the high rate care as well. It's not just a case of having a diagnosis. Some of the other questions, it's more difficult to answer because it's more about having the discussion with the parent, I think, and perhaps I'd encourage people to call the helpline and to discuss their cases. Sometimes you might be able to get a call back with one of us just to discuss your case in a bit more detail, especially people who are going to appeal or who are worried that if they ask DLA to look again at a claim, they might lose what they already have. We can't help with filling in forms. Unfortunately, we don't have the capacity, but we can help you with some case law. We can help you with a bit of advice about what kind of things you should emphasize to a tribunal, for example. What kind of information would be useful. So people are asking about psychologist reports. Yes, those can be very useful. They are a professional person who specifically look at some of these points as well, so it can be very useful. It's worth checking that any reports that you send in, that you agree with them, that you think they are providing the full picture and a correct picture of your child's needs, because you don't want anything that's going to cause a decision maker to think, oh, well, they're not that bad, then we just won't bother looking at this. It is worthwhile. You make sure that you have got good information, that it is correct what's being said about your child. Don't be scared to ask for letters and support from professionals for this as well. I'm just seeing, I think there's quite a lot of other, just having a look, see if there's any more questions have just come in. People are asking about the physical needs as well. I think that would be a different session to this. To qualify purely for a physical condition, for the high rate mobility, it's different. It is different rules that apply.
I'll probably touch on that slightly in a few minutes, Marianne. The other thing I noticed a few people have asked in the chat is their child's approaching 16 and they're preparing for that process, and are the SMI rules the same under PIP? It's probably worth just confirming at this point that actually the rules are actually completely different under PIP. There is no test of severe mental impairment as such. There's no, all these tests about meeting a diagnostic test and showing your child has specific behaviors. All of that goes out the window under PIP. They have their own test, which is in a lot of ways much more streamlined and much simpler. So under PIP, which is personal independence payment, a young person should qualify for the enhanced rate of mobility if they can show that they're unable to follow the route of a familiar journey without another person, an assistance dog, or an orientation aid. So that's really the test. It's a question of, for whatever reasons, whether it's learning disability because of their behavior needs or whatever, that if your child is unable to follow the route of a journey that they know, that they've been shown, if they can't follow that independently and they would need another person to be with them on familiar journeys, then they should score 12 points. And that would be enough to get them the enhanced rate mobility. So it's, definitely a much easier route actually under PIP. There's a lot of criticisms of personal independent payment, and it's probably true to say that overall there are more losers than winners when people move over onto the PIP system. But the one group of people who potentially do better under PIP are children with, learning difficulties and challenging behaviors, because it's much easier to qualify for the enhanced rate under PIP than it is under DLA. Okay, so we finished looking at the severe mental impairment tests. What we're going to do now is turn to the other main route of getting higher rate mobility where there's behavior issues. And that's under the test of whether or not a child can be said to be virtually unable to walk. So let's just say that you've looked at the SMI test and you've come to the conclusion that unfortunately your child doesn't meet the specific rules that have been set out. Either they don't have nighttime needs and therefore are not going to be able to get the higher rate of the care component, or perhaps they maybe only need restraint outdoors and not indoors, or perhaps they can go for periods where they don't need someone to be present and watching over. Does that mean that they can't get high rate mobility? Well, it means they can't get high rate mobility on the grounds of severe mental impairment, but they might still be able to qualify on this alternative grounds. Now, what's interesting about this is it's exactly the same route to high rate mobility as children with physical disabilities generally use. So the test is really that the child's physical condition as a whole means that their ability to walk outdoors is so limited, taking into account the distance, the speed, the time, and the manner in which progress is made on foot, that they can be said to be virtually unable to walk. So, where a child has a physical problem, if they have, say, pain or severe breathlessness, what they're usually arguing is that, that their ability to walk without severe discomfort is so limited that they should be counted as virtually unable to walk. And for physical conditions, what tends to happen is that the DLA unit tend to prioritize distance over all the other factors. And as a rough rule of thumb, they tend to use sort of 50 meters as a sort of benchmark. If you can show that your child is unable to walk 50 meters without severe discomfort, whether that's pain or severe breathlessness, then they tend to be willing to award high rate mobility. Where a child can walk several hundred meters before the onset of discomfort, then they're probably not going to qualify. Between the 50 meters and a couple of hundred meters, it may depend on how long it takes, the speed of their walking, the manner of their walking, such like. Now, this test, though, can also be used where a child has behavioral problems, and the reason for that is that although the test says that the inability to walk must arise from the physical condition, it's not limited to physical symptoms like pain and breathlessness. So an inability to make progress on foot in any meaningful way that's due to behavioral problems can count too, but only if it results from a condition that has a physical origin. Okay, so if your child has behaviors where they refuse to walk, throw themselves on the ground, go limp when you try to get them to stand up, if they lash out or kick out at you when you attempt to encourage them to start walking again, those behaviors could be seen as impacting on their ability to walk and the method of their walking to such an extent that they should be classed as virtually unable to walk. Now, the DLA unit will often refer to these as refusal episodes. We prefer to describe them as temporary interruptions in the ability to walk. And part of the reason for that is because we feel that the word refusal kind of has connotations that the child is choosing to act in this way. And as we'll see in a few minutes, that's one that can often be quite a problematic area here. But basically, we just want to get across the idea that in looking at this test and taking into account the manner in which your child's walking, that as long as you can show that the behavior problems that they're exhibiting are connected to a condition that has a physical origin, then it's possible to argue that your child could meet this test and be seen as virtually unable to walk. And it's been accepted in case law that conditions like autism, for example, or Down syndrome, or certain genetic conditions or chromosome disorders are conditions that have a physical origin. So the behavioral problems that your child exhibits as a result of those conditions can count. And if they're severe enough, then they could potentially lead to your child qualifying on the basis of these temporary interruptions in their ability to walk. Now, when we're advising parents about this, we tend to sort of flag up that there's three main hurdles that you need to meet in trying to convince a decision maker that you meet these tests. One is showing that your child's behavior stems from a condition with a physical origin, which ultimately is a sort of diagnostic question. Secondly, there's issues around how often are the refusal episodes happening or the temporary interruptions happening. And finally, there's a major issue with convincing decision makers that what they're dealing with here is a child who can't walk rather than a child who's simply choosing not to walk. And we're going to look at each of these issues in turn just now. So in terms of arguing it's a condition that has a physical origin, there's some really helpful case law. There's a decision that specifically looked at Down syndrome, said that a child who refused to walk, that could be classed as interruptions in walking, and that they could be virtually unable to walk, because Down syndrome is accepted as having a physical origin. It's due to faulty genetic makeup. It can be seen under a microscope. So there was no dispute that it was at a physical origin. And, interruptions in walking, or what was described as a temporary paralysis in walking, was relevant when deciding whether that child was virtually unable to walk. Also, CDLA 3839 2007 says that autistic children who frequently refuse to walk can also qualify on these grounds if their ability to walk outdoors is so limited because of the frequent refusals mean that they're virtually unable to walk. So it's clear that a child who's autistic or has a condition like Down syndrome definitely can be considered under this test, but it's not automatic. It's not enough to show they have a condition of that nature. You'll also have to show that the behavioral issues, that the temporary interruptions are happening frequently enough that the child can be said to be virtually unable to walk. And you'll have to prove or convince a decision maker that this child can be said to be unable to walk or virtually unable to walk, rather than just a child who's choosing not to walk. In terms of establishing whether the episodes are happening with enough frequency, there isn't actually anything in the case law that addresses how frequent it needs to be. But what we need to bear in mind is that this question arises in relation to this test of being virtually unable to walk. So it's clear that that's quite a stiff test to meet. If a child only has these episodes sort of periodically or intermittently, it's probably going to be quite difficult to get a decision maker to accept that they meet the test. I think realistically, your child would have to be manifesting these sort of behaviors on a high proportion of times that they're outdoors. It would have to be quite a common occurrence, I think, for you to be able to argue this. But the biggest issue that we come across, and the most common refusal that we see families be given in decisions, is that the DWP will really commonly argue that the issue here is not that it's a child who can't walk, but it's a child who won't walk, and that DLA is not, the mobility component is not there for children who choose not to walk. And you'll see this be argued time and time again. You'll see decision makers say that these events or these refusal episodes are in the control of the child or part of the child's conscious volition. So what the DWP are effectively saying here is that what these cases involve is a child who's been stubborn or willful or naughty, rather than it being a child who's unable to walk or virtually unable to walk. And we have a great problem with that kind of argument. We think it's like, when we know that children have a whole raft of symptoms like sensory distress and lack of coordination and anxiety, to put them all to one side and to assume that the child is choosing not to walk, we think is really difficult to justify. But the reason that you see this come up so often is because there is some case law that's kind of said that this is a decision that decision makers need to take into account, and they need to factor into their decisions whether they believe a child is under control of these episodes or not. So the main decision is RM 3 of 86, which was made by a tribunal of commissioners. And they definitely said that you have to draw a distinction between children who couldn't walk and children who wouldn't walk. And they actually gave an example in their decision of a child who was able to walk, but then refused to walk. And if that refusal could be overcome by the promise of a reward or a threat of punishment, then there could be no question of his stopping having arisen out of a physical condition over which he had no control. So in the Tribunal of Commissioners' view, if a child could be persuaded or bribed into continuing walking after a temporary interruption, then that was a child who was choosing not to walk rather than virtually unable to walk. So one of the issues if you're filling in a DLA form or a mandatory reconsideration request, if your child's sort of refusal episodes are really difficult to overcome, if they're really entrenched, if pleading with them and trying to bribe them doesn't work, it's really important that you put that into whatever evidence you're submitting, because that is going to be something that definitely the tribunal or the decision maker will have to look at. But actually, what's interesting is that this sort of view of the Tribunal of Commissioners has been challenged by more recent decisions. And there are judges who've taken a different view and said that even if you can overcome the refusal episodes, it might still be possible to argue that your child is virtually unable to walk rather than choosing not to walk. And probably the decision that most powerfully set this out is a decision, CDLA 4565 of 2003. And I'll just read what the judge said here, because I think it's very eloquent. So the judge in this case said that children who suffer from conditions such as autism, Down syndrome, or Williams syndrome, they have a raft of symptoms which are relevant to their ability to walk, but which may make them not wish to walk, including clumsiness, lack of coordination, anxiety, fearfulness, poor balance, muscle weakness, lack of endurance, breathlessness. And to say that such a child who can be persuaded or coaxed to walk further is not suffering from problems which stem from a physical disablement must be wrong and based on a generalization. So the judge in this case is saying we need to look at the medical evidence about the type of symptoms that this child is likely to experience. And those we need to give proper serious consideration that these may be the things that are causing the refusal episodes and are things that the child doesn't really have any control over and is not really making a conscious choice around. And then another decision, similarly, the judge said that where a child has a condition that results in behavioral problems, the Department of Work and Pensions must provide very clear reasons for attributing the refusal episodes to something other than their condition. What evidence does the DWP have that the child is deliberately choosing not to walk in a way that's unconnected with their disability? So it's turning it on its head, really, and saying, if we know the child has these symptoms that that's likely to cause interruptions in walking, where's the evidence that the DWP have that would suggest that there's some other explanation for this? They can't just suggest that the child is choosing not to walk without explaining why they believe that to be the case.